In the quiet halls of Westminster and the grieving towns of post-industrial England, a long overdue conversation is gaining momentum. One not about budgets or Brexit, but about justice. Justice for the hundreds of thousands of victims, particularly white working-class girls, who suffered sexual abuse at the hands of white men in communities where silence was too often policy and complicity wore a collar or a badge. Listen to how angry Liberal Democrat Tessa Munt is when Conservative MPs discuss the rape gang scandal in Parliament.
Tessa Munt.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I say my blood is boiling listening to this stuff coming from the Conservative benches. If they had read the ICSA, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, they would recognise that there are hundreds of thousands of people alive today, people just like me, white girls who suffered at the hands of white men, and they've just got clean away with it because nothing was done for so long. I welcome the statement that was made today. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And I just say, I think I'm very glad to hear that this is the start of a plan and not a finish. Of course, not rocket science. I recognise the value of mandatory reporting, and I recognise indeed the importance of criminalising those who obstruct an individual from reporting. I wondered if we could also step that down a little bit and say that those who coerce or gently discourage, particularly those from reporting, would also be somehow captured in that criminalisation. And may I also ask that I know the Minister knows that I have been working on an amendment to clause 45 of the bill, which will cover religious institutions and faith-based organisations, and that there should be no longer a convention of absolute confidentiality for those who take confession in that religious setting. There's a conflict and a tension, and we need to make sure that that in some way is made explicit and that no one is excluded from mandatory reporting.
The long-awaited findings of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, ICSA, have triggered a wave of public revulsion and political urgency. But the truth is, this wasn't a sudden awakening. For decades, the signs were there. Victims came forward. Some were ignored. Others were dismissed, belittled, or worse, actively discouraged by institutions sworn to protect them. The report simply confirmed what too many already knew. This was systemic. At the heart of the ICSA's revelations lies a painful paradox. Britain, a country that prides itself on fair play, the rule of law, and moral clarity, allowed the systematic exploitation of its most vulnerable citizens, while institutions from schools to churches to social services turned the other way. For all its cultural commitment to child welfare, the country failed to create a culture of accountability. Now, the political class is being forced to confront a question that can no longer be avoided. What happens next? It's not enough to express horror after the fact. It's not enough to commission reports, hold inquiries, or tweet condolences. Real reform begins with law, and real law begins with courage. Munt, known for her persistent advocacy for child safety and legislative reform, spoke candidly about the institutional reluctance to act, particularly in cases involving religious or educational authorities. Her speech cut through the polite platitudes of parliamentary dialogue with the cold, hard truth. We have constructed a system that punishes whistleblowers and protects predators. This debate places Britain at a moral crossroads. Is it willing to apply the same standards of accountability to faith institutions that it demands from secular ones? Or will the country continue to allow a parallel system of silence, where sin can be whispered into a darkened booth and left there forever, no matter the human cost? The ICSA's findings are uncomfortably specific. The overwhelming majority of victims in several major abuse scandals, in Rotherham, Rochdale, Oxford, and elsewhere, were white working-class girls, and in many of these cases, the perpetrators were white men, often embedded in the same communities as their victims. That silence is part of the injustice. Victims were made invisible not only by their abusers, but by a system that didn't want to deal with them, not because they weren't believed, but because they weren't politically convenient. It is now the responsibility of legislators and journalists alike to speak with clarity. This crisis is not just about pedophilia. It is about power, class, and the institutions that would rather preserve their image than protect their people. What Tessa Munt and other advocates are demanding is not comfortable, and it is not easy. It challenges sacred cows. It demands that we place the safety of children above the reputations of bishops, headmasters, and community leaders. It means making enemies. But as the IXA made devastatingly clear, the cost of inaction is counted in lives shattered, futures stolen, and trust irrevocably lost.
How significant is this that this announcement's taken place the day before Parliament goes into recess, ahead of Easter holidays, and just before local elections? Because there is definitely a theme that we know runs through this. A lot of the towns and cities where this has been happening, it is Labour councils with a large local Pakistani Muslim population where this has been happening.
So I think on your first point, it is obviously true. It's just total common sense that people who have done wrong are not going to ask to be investigated. And I think it's worth dwelling for a moment on the fact that not one person, not a single person, has been convicted for covering up this institutionalized sexual torture. Nobody has been convicted of misconduct in public office or any kind of collusion and corruption around this, even though we know from the evidence and from the stories that that's happened. You've got social workers attending the so-called weddings of 15-year-olds who are marrying their abusers. One of the rape gang ringleaders worked for the council. He was employed by the council. So we know that this has happened.
Yeah, you raised that. But he was actually employed as wasn't he in child safeguarding?
Well, he worked in
a welfare rights officer, sorry.
Yeah, he was a welfare rights officer, and then he was seconded to the local community centre. And even after he was arrested, the police didn't tell the community centre that he'd been arrested for these crimes. I mean, once you start going into it, the layers and layers of horror are almost unbelievable. But I think it is significant that it was the last day before recess. There were fewer people in Parliament. The government had insisted that they were going to give an update on this before Easter, and then it all went very quiet. Tom Crowther, Casey, who was the lawyer that they had initially said was going to lead these so-called local inquiries, spoke at the Home Affairs Select Committee last week and was pretty scathing about the interaction that he's had with the Home Office. So, exactly as you said earlier, this is not really about party politics, but it is difficult to draw any conclusion other than that the government just don't want us to look at this.
As Parliament recesses and local elections loom, a disturbing silence hangs over Westminster. Despite years of revelations about institutionalized sexual abuse in towns like Rotherham and Rochdale, with significant Pakistani Muslim populations, no one has been held accountable. No convictions, no resignations. Just silence. Julia Hartley, Brewer's recent interview with Katie Lamb reignited public outrage over how the state continues to fail vulnerable girls. Social workers, police and local councils, particularly. Yet, even now, the government appears more interested in managing optics than delivering justice. The Home Office's decision to issue a vague, non-committal statement just before recess is telling. Lawyer Tom Crowther Casey described it as strategy, not oversight, aimed at avoiding scrutiny rather than addressing systemic failure. He's right. Despite repeated inquiries confirming institutional cowardice and political correctness as key enablers of abuse, officials continue to deflect responsibility. This isn't just a Labour failure. It's a national disgrace implicating the entire political class. The Conservative, led Home Office has had years to act decisively, but continues to stall. Senior ministers remain silent. Victims remain ignored. Katie Lamb rightly noted the state's willingness to enforce lockdowns and regulate speech, yet its stunning inaction on child sexual abuse. Why? Fear, cowardice, priorities. Until justice is served and those complicit are held accountable. This silence is complicity. The victims deserve more than statements. They deserve action.